Darius Carter was just a young black photojournalist who believed that truth mattered. Until one winter morning, when he found an abandoned white child on the steps of a church and decided to raise him as his own son. Years later, that love turned into suspicion when police mistook fatherhood for a crime. Kindness became evidence. Silence became a crime. And a good man was condemned by a system that never tried to understand him, until a small voice dared to speak the truth. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe that racial prejudice should not exist, then this story is for you. Winter in Pittsburgh arrived like a blade, clean, sharp, and unforgiving. The wind funneled through narrow streets, rattling bare branches against brick row houses, and turning every breath into a pale ghost. Downtown, the river carried sheets of gray ice that looked like broken glass. For most people, it was a season to stay inside. For Darius Carter, it was a season that kept demanding witnesses. Darius Carter was 28, tall and lean with a wiry strength that came from long hours on his feet and a life that didn't allow softness. His skin was a deep brown that seemed almost warm against the winter's cold light. He kept his hair closely cropped, neat and practical, and his face was clean-shaven. Sharp cheekbones, steady dark eyes, and the kind of calm expression that didn't come naturally but was practiced. Not because he was emotionless, because he'd learned that showing too much emotion in the wrong place could turn into a problem fast. He wore a battered canvas jacket over a hoodie, jeans that had seen too many late nights, and a camera strap that never left his shoulder. The camera was not just a job. It was his shield and his purpose. As a local photojournalist, Darius spent his days chasing the stories people tried to ignore. Fires, evictions, protests, car crashes, everything that proved the world was always on the edge of something. Tonight, that edge had been a warehouse fire on the south side. The flames were out now, leaving behind a skeleton of blackened beams and a smell that clung to the throat. Darius had taken the last shot he needed. Firefighters in reflective coats standing in steam, their faces tired but still alert. The kind of image that would sit on a news site for a few hours and then disappear under tomorrow's disaster. He packed up, fingers stiff from cold, and started walking toward his old sedan parked a block away. That was when he heard it. Not a scream. Not loud enough for that. A thin, strangled sound, like a sob trapped in a throat that didn't have strength left. The kind of cry that didn't demand attention, only begged for it. Darius stopped mid-step. The city was never truly quiet, but this sound cut through everything. Traffic hum, distant sirens, the wind itself. He followed it. The cry led him uphill, away from the burnt warehouse and into a neighborhood that changed its face block by block. Old churches, small storefronts, rows of houses with sagging porches. The streetlights here were dimmer, their glow weak against the winter darkness. St. Agnes Church stood at the corner like something out of time. Stone walls stained by decades, a heavy wooden door, and steps worn smooth by countless feet. The church wasn't famous. It wasn't wealthy, but it had always been there, quietly holding the neighborhood together through funerals, weddings, and the kind of prayers people whispered when they didn't know what else to do. The cry came again. Right at the steps, Darius approached slowly, not because he was afraid, but because he'd learned the world was full of traps disguised as emergencies. Still, his instincts weren't the kind that ran away. They ran toward. On the third step, half hidden in shadow, lay a bundle. Something small wrapped in a thin, fraying blanket. Another cry. Closer. Weak. Darius crouched down. Inside the blanket was a little boy about 3 years old, white skin gone pale from cold, cheeks raw and damp with tears. His lips were bluish, trembling. His hair was light brown, messy, pressed flat in places as if he'd been laid down too quickly. His eyes, wide, glassy, frightened, locked onto Darius like a drowning person spotting a hand. The boy's fingers were clenched around a small plastic toy car, one wheel missing. The car looked cheap, scuffed, loved hard, and then abandoned. On the boy's wrist was a thin, disposable hospital band. Faded, the ink smudged but still readable. A name written in shaky marker, Eli. No note, no diaper bag, no coat, no adult in sight. Darius's chest tightened, and for a second the world narrowed into a single thought. Someone left him here to freeze. Darius slid his hands under the boy carefully. The child flinched at first, then melted into his arms like he didn't have enough strength to resist. He felt too light, an alarming kind of light. "Hey," Darius said softly, his voice rough from smoke and cold. "It's okay. I've got you." The boy's eyes blinked slowly, tears freezing at the corners. Darius pulled off his own jacket and wrapped it around the child, tucking it close. Then he stood, holding Eli against his chest, and moved fast. His car was cold inside, but it started on the first try. Darius cranked the heat all the way up. He adjusted the vents so warm air hit the child's face and hands. Eli's breathing was quick and shallow. "Stay with me, kid," Darius murmured, as if the boy could understand every word. "Just stay with me." He drove with one hand, the other holding the boy steady, eyes scanning the empty streets like he expected someone to jump out and stop him. No one did. At Mercy Hospital, the automatic doors slid open and a blast of indoor warmth hit them. Darius carried Eli straight to the triage desk. A nurse stepped forward immediately. Her name tag read, Sarah Donovan. Sarah Donovan was in her early 40s, average height, with a solid, practical build that suggested long shifts and heavy responsibilities. Her auburn hair was pulled into a tight bun, and she had pale skin with tired lines around her eyes that didn't come from age as much as from witnessing too much. Her gaze was sharp, professional, but not unkind. The kind of person who had learned to keep her heart behind a locked door, except sometimes when a child forced it open. She looked at the boy in Darius's arms, and her expression changed. Just a flicker, but enough to show something human underneath the clinical calm. "What happened?" she asked. "I found him outside," Darius said. "On church steps. He's freezing." Sarah was already moving, motioning for a wheelchair and calling out instructions. "We need a pediatric room, now." As she guided them down the hall, she glanced at Darius. "Is he your son?" The question was routine. It was also a door that could swing two ways. Darius hesitated for half a heartbeat. He could tell the truth. "No. I don't know him. I just found him." But the truth wasn't always safe. The truth could invite delay, and this boy didn't have time for delay. Darius looked down at Eli, at the tiny fingers clutching that broken toy car, at the fear in his eyes, at the way his body trembled with cold and uncertainty. Then Darius lifted his chin and answered, calm and solid, "I'm his father." Sarah's eyes searched his face, not suspiciously but carefully, like she was weighing something. For a moment, Darius wondered if she could see through him, if she could see that what he meant wasn't biology, but choice. Eli let out a small whimper, and Sarah's expression softened. She nodded once. "Okay," she said. "Then stay close." In the pediatric room, nurses moved with practiced urgency. They checked temperature, pulse, oxygen. They wrapped Eli in warm blankets, placed heating packs near his feet, started a gentle IV. Darius stood just behind the bed, hands clenched, trying not to look like a man on the edge of panic. Sarah returned with a cup of water for Darius that he didn't realize he needed until it was in his hand. "You did the right thing bringing him in," she said. Darius didn't answer immediately. He watched Eli's eyelids flutter as warmth finally reached him. The boy's breathing eased by inches, like life was slowly deciding to stay. "Someone left him," Darius said, voice low. Sarah's jaw tightened. A small, controlled anger crossed her face. "People do things," she said, and the way she said it hinted at history. Cases she'd seen, nights she'd held children while parents screamed, moments that had carved her into someone who didn't waste words on disbelief. After a while, Sarah stepped out to make calls, to child services, to security, to whoever had to be notified when a child appeared out of nowhere. Darius stayed. Eli woke once, crying softly, reaching out. Darius immediately leaned in and held his hand. "It's okay," Darius whispered. "I'm here." Eli's fingers closed around Darius's thumb like it was the only safe thing left in the world. Darius didn't know when the decision became permanent. Maybe it happened when he lied at the triage desk. Maybe it happened when Eli's grip tightened. Maybe it had been waiting inside him for years. Because Darius had once been a kid nobody expected much from. He grew up with a mother who worked 2 jobs and still smiled like she had a secret supplies of hope. He grew up learning that being a young black man meant people saw threat before they saw humanity. He grew up watching his neighborhood get photographed, only when something went wrong, when there was blood, when there was fire, when there was grief. That's why he became a photojournalist. He wanted to point the lens at the things that mattered before they broke. And now, in this fluorescent hospital room, he was staring at something that mattered more than any headline. Hours later, Sarah returned with 2 people in plain clothes, child services. They spoke in careful tones, asked Darius questions, wrote notes. Darius answered calmly, even when he could feel his heart hammering. They would take Eli, they said. Standard procedure, temporary placement, investigation, foster system. Darius had heard enough stories to know what temporary could become when a child got lost in paperwork. He looked at Eli again. The boy had fallen asleep, holding the broken toy car against his chest, like it was a proof he'd existed before this moment. Darius inhaled slowly. "I want to be considered," he said. "If he needs a placement, I want to be considered." The child services worker, a woman with a neutral expression, raised an eyebrow. "You're not related." "I can be," Darius said, "legally." Sarah stood behind them, silent. But her eyes were on Darius, and there was something there. Recognition, maybe, respect, or simply the understanding that sometimes people didn't step forward because it was easy. They stepped forward because it was right. The worker gave Darius a look that said, "You have no idea what you're asking for." Darius held the look without blinking. "Then, start the process," he said. When they left, Sarah returned to the room one more time. She adjusted Eli's blanket gently, then looked at Darius. "You know this won't be simple," she said. Darius nodded. "Nothing important ever is." Sarah studied him for a long moment. Then she spoke in a quieter voice, the voice of a woman who had learned to hide tenderness like contraband. "Most people walk away," she said. "They bring the kid in, they feel good, and they walk away." Darius's eyes stayed on Eli. "I'm not most people." Sarah's mouth tightened like she was holding back emotion. She cleared her throat and straightened. "Okay," she said, brisk again. "Then don't." Darius sat back down in the chair beside the bed. He didn't know what tomorrow would look like. He didn't know what kind of battle he was stepping into. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever the world tried to say about him, whatever it tried to do, this child would not be abandoned again. Not while Darius Carter still had breath in his body. Outside the hospital window, Pittsburgh's winter kept blowing, indifferent and cold. Inside, in a small room filled with fluorescent light and soft blankets, something warmer began. Quiet, stubborn, and real. And on the boy's wrist, the faded band still read E-L-I. As if the world was giving Darius one clear instruction. Remember his name. Protect it. The paperwork began the next morning, and it did not stop. Darius learned quickly that adoption was not an act. It was a process designed to test endurance. Forms multiplied like snowdrifts. There were background checks, financial disclosures, home inspections, psychological evaluations, and interviews that asked the same question 3 different ways, as if truth might change shape when pressed hard enough. He answered calmly each time, his voice steady, his eyes attentive, because he understood something the system didn't always recognize. Panic never helped a child. Eli stayed in the pediatric wing for several days, wrapped in borrowed pajamas that swallowed his small frame. He spoke little at first. When he did, his words came out careful, like he was rationing them. He followed Darius everywhere with his eyes. When a nurse entered the room, Eli's fingers tightened around Darius's sleeve until the nurse left again. Sarah Donovan checked in on them whenever her shift allowed. She kept her professional distance, but it was clear she had opinions. Sarah was the kind of woman who had learned to survive by control. Control of her voice, her posture, her expectations. She'd grown up bouncing between relatives after her own mother died young, an experience that taught her 2 lessons early. Attachments could disappear, and children paid the price. It explained why she rarely smiled at adults and why she always knelt to speak to kids at eye level. "This part is going to be loud," she told Darius one afternoon, lowering her voice. "A lot of people will have thoughts." Darius nodded. "They already do." When Eli was cleared for discharge into temporary placement, the caseworker returned. Marianne Holt, a woman in her late 50s with iron-gray hair cut short and a posture that suggested rules were safer than empathy. She spoke precisely, as if language itself might break if handled casually. She explained the steps again, careful to say temporary and subject to review, careful not to promise anything that could be taken away later. Darius listened, then said, "I want to move forward." Marianne studied him, eyes flicking to his clothes, his hands, his face. She had seen men like him before, determined, calm, convincing. She had also seen how easily public pressure could undo good intentions. Still, she nodded and handed him another packet. "If you're serious," she said, "we'll start." The first home visit came a week later. Darius's apartment was small but orderly, a second-floor walk-up with creaking steps, a living room that doubled as a workspace, walls lined with framed photographs, fires frozen mid-flame, faces caught in moments of grief and courage. There was a narrow kitchen that smelled faintly of coffee and toasted bread. The bedroom held a single bed and a dresser scarred with use. Darius had already begun rearranging, clearing space for a child-sized bed he hadn't bought yet, afraid to jinx it. Marianne took notes, her pen scratching steadily. She asked about income stability, hours, childcare plans. Darius answered without embellishment. He explained his schedule, his savings, his willingness to adjust assignments. He spoke about boundaries, about safety, about patience. "What about discipline?" Marianne asked. "I don't confuse fear with respect," Darius replied. "I teach. I don't threaten." Marianne paused, then wrote something longer than usual. The waiting rooms were the worst. Plastic chairs, humming lights, and the sense that everyone was evaluating everyone else. At one intake meeting, a white couple sat across from Darius, their hands intertwined. They were polished in a way that suggested comfort. Expensive coats, confident smiles. The woman glanced at Eli, then at Darius, and smiled thinly. "He's beautiful," she said, tilting her head. "He'll do well with the right fit." Darius felt the sentence land where it was meant to. Eli, sitting beside him, stared at the floor. "We're the right fit," Darius said evenly. The man cleared his throat. The woman's smile tightened, then disappeared. At night, back in the apartment, Darius kept the routine simple. Sandwiches cut into triangles, milk warmed just enough. The sound of his camera shutter softened by distance as he uploaded photos in the other room. Eli slept on a borrowed mattress at first, a blanket tucked under his chin. He woke from nightmares some nights, crying without sound, and Darius would sit on the edge of the bed, one hand resting lightly on Eli's back until his breathing slowed. Eli began to talk more. About trucks, about a dog he once saw tied outside a store, about a place he couldn't remember but still missed. Darius listened without interruption, letting the boy lead the pace. When the caseworker approved a provisional placement, Darius bought the bed. He assembled it himself, fingers clumsy with excitement, measuring twice and tightening screws until the frame felt solid enough to hold the future. He hung a small nightlight shaped like a star and placed the broken toy car on the bedside table like a relic. School came next. Kindergarten orientation smelled like crayons and disinfectant. The teacher, Ms. Pauline Reyes, was in her 30s, warm-eyed and brisk with dark hair pulled into a low ponytail. She had a way of speaking that put children at ease and adults on notice. She welcomed Eli kindly, asked Darius about allergies, about routines, about comfort items. The first weeks passed quietly. Then the whispers started. Children repeated what they heard. One afternoon, Eli came home unusually silent. He went straight to his room and buried his face in the pillow. "Someone said you stole me," he whispered later, voice muffled. "They said I don't belong with you." Darius sat beside him, his movements slow, deliberate. He did not rush to correct the world. He corrected the wound. "You belong where you're loved," he said. "And people say things when they don't understand. That's their work to do, not yours." Eli nodded, but the words stayed with him like splinters. Life settled into a rhythm anyway. Breakfasts, school drop-offs, evenings filled with books and stories. Darius taught Eli to read using old newspaper headlines, tracing letters with his finger, turning hard words into games. He explained the difference between facts and opinions, between truth and noise. Eli learned quickly. He asked thoughtful questions. He liked stories about people who did the right thing when it was harder. Down the hall lived Claire Bennett. Claire was in her early 30s, tall and slender, with sharp features softened by an easy smile that didn't always reach her eyes. She wore her brown hair loose most days, a habit she never quite broke from years in the field. A freelance investigative journalist, she had moved into the building chasing lower rent and higher proximity to the city's underbelly. She believed stories lived in ordinary places. She first noticed Darius when he returned a camera that had been stolen from her during a protest months earlier. He hadn't asked for thanks. He'd simply handed it over and said, "You'll want your work back." Now she noticed the child. The cautious way Eli clung to Darius's hand. The way Darius bent slightly to listen when Eli spoke, as if nothing else mattered in that moment. One evening, Claire held the door open for them. "Hey," she said lightly, "I'm Claire." "Darius?" he replied. "This is Eli." Eli nodded, shy but curious. Claire smiled at him. "Hi, Eli." Later that night, Claire overheard a conversation in the stairwell. Two tenants talking about the odd couple upstairs, about how it didn't look right. The words were familiar. The tone was not. Claire had learned long ago that when people insisted something didn't look right, it usually meant it hadn't been examined closely enough. She made a note. Not about Darius. About the building. About the neighborhood. About how quickly narratives formed. The adoption process stretched on, months marked by stamps and signatures. Eli began to call Darius Dad one night without ceremony, the word slipping out like it had been waiting. Darius froze, then smiled, then said nothing, afraid to scare it away. The day the papers finally came through, they were thin and heavy all at once. Legal language, official seals, a new last name. Eli Carter. Darius signed carefully, his hand steady, his breath shallow. When it was done, Marianne nodded and closed the folder. "It's official," she said. "Congratulations." Darius thanked her. Eli squeezed his hand. On the walk home, snow fell lightly, catching in Eli's hair. He looked up, smiling, and said, "So that's my name now?" "That's your name," Darius said. Eli tried it out, quietly like a secret. Eli Carter. The city moved around them, indifferent and alive. Darius felt the weight of the world lift by inches. He did not know what lay ahead. He only knew what stood beside him now. And for the first time since that winter night on the church steps, the future felt like something that could be built. By the time Eli turned 10, Pittsburgh no longer felt like a place that questioned their existence every single day, but it never fully stopped watching them either. Early spring had arrived with wet sidewalks and low gray clouds that pressed down on the city like a held breath. Snow was gone, replaced by slush and rain, and the rivers ran thick and restless. Life looked ordinary again. That illusion mattered. Darius marked Eli's birthday the way he marked everything else in their lives. Quietly, deliberately. No parties that drew attention. No spectacle. Just a cake, candles, and the promise of a movie night at home. On the way home from school, they stopped at the giant eagle near their apartment, the fluorescent-lit kind that smelled of baked bread and floor cleaner. Eli walked beside him, taller now, long-limbed and awkward in the way boys often are at 10. His hair was still light brown, cut unevenly because he hated sitting still at the barber. His face carried traces of the toddler Darius had once carried through a hospital door. But there was something sturdier there now. Curiosity, humor, and a cautious awareness of how the world could shift without warning. He clutched a folded piece of paper in his hand. The list. Cake mix, frosting, candles, chocolate bars. Darius followed with the cart, his camera slung across his chest out of habit. He didn't plan to use it. He never did. But years of working the streets had trained his body to keep it close, like a reflex. They moved through the aisles easily. Eli read labels aloud, mispronouncing words on purpose to make Darius smile. At the candy aisle, Eli reached up for a box of chocolates, lost his grip, and the box slipped, hitting the floor with a dull crack. "I'm sorry," Eli said immediately, bending to pick it up. A store employee a few feet away looked over. He was a white man in his early 20s, thin, with a red store vest hanging loosely off narrow shoulders. His eyebrows knit together, not in concern, but suspicion. He didn't say anything. He just watched. Darius met his gaze and gave a small nod, the universal signal of accountability. "We'll pay for it," he said calmly. The employee didn't respond. He turned and walked quickly toward the front of the store. Eli sensed the shift before Darius did. His shoulders tightened. He stepped closer, his hand finding Darius's wrist. "It's okay," Darius murmured. "Accidents happen." But the air had already changed. Minutes later, Officer Brian Keller entered the store. Keller was in his late 30s, tall and broad, with a rigid posture that suggested authority was something he wore as much as the uniform, attaching to his frame like armor. His hair was cut close, blonde, turning sandy at the temples. His jaw was square, his expression set in a permanent scowl that made it hard to tell where professionalism ended and contempt began. He walked with confidence born not from calm judgment, but from certainty that he would be obeyed. He didn't scan the room. He locked onto Darius. Keller stopped a few feet away, hand resting near his belt. He didn't address Eli. He addressed the situation he believed he already understood. "Who's the kid?" he asked. Darius felt the eyes before he saw them. Other shoppers pausing, carts stalling, conversations dropping into silence. "My son," Darius replied. He reached for his wallet, already prepared. "Eli Carter." He handed over the adoption papers, the insurance card, the school ID tucked neatly behind it. He had learned to carry proof the way other people carried keys. Keller barely glanced down. He flipped through the cards with his thumb, slow and dismissive, then handed them back. "This doesn't prove anything," Keller said. Eli's fingers tightened around Darius's sleeve. His breathing picked up. "He's white," Keller continued. "You're black. You expect me to believe this?" Darius felt heat rise behind his eyes, but his voice stayed even. "I don't need you to believe it. I need you to read." Keller's mouth curled. "Don't tell me how to do my job." Around them, phones were already coming out. People lifted them instinctively, the way crowds always did when they sensed drama. Someone whispered. Someone else shook their head. Eli tried to speak. "That's my dad." "Quiet," Keller snapped, finally looking at him. Not kindly, not reassuringly, just enough to silence. Darius stepped slightly in front of Eli without touching him. "There's no problem here," he said. "We dropped a box, that's it." Keller took a step closer. "You're being detained." "For what?" Darius asked. "Suspicion," Keller replied. The word landed heavy, vague, flexible, dangerous. Keller reached for the cuffs. Darius didn't pull away, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't argue. He knew better. He also knew what still happened, even when you did everything right. Metal closed around his wrists. Eli cried out, the sound sharp and sudden. "Dad!" The store seemed to tilt. Darius turned as much as the cuffs allowed. "Eli, look at me," he said steadily. "I'm okay." Eli shook his head, tears spilling freely now. "You didn't do anything!" "I know," Darius said. "Breathe." Keller guided him forward roughly, ignoring Eli's sobs. The phones were fully raised now, a forest of screens capturing the moment from every angle. Within seconds, the narrative was forming, fast and irreversible. A black man in handcuffs, a crying, white child. Keller led them out of the store. Rain had started again, a light drizzle that streaked the parking lot. Keller opened the back of the patrol car. "Get in," he ordered. "What about my son?" Darius asked. Keller hesitated, then gestured for Eli to climb in as well. Eli hesitated, looking up at Darius, terrified. "It's okay," Darius said softly. "Stay close." The drive to the station was short and silent except for Eli's quiet sobbing. Darius stared straight ahead, jaw tight, memorizing every detail. The route, the time, the feeling. Experience told him memory might matter later. At the station, fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The air smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. Keller guided Darius through processing with efficient indifference. He asked questions that weren't really questions. He ignored answers that didn't fit. Eli was seated on a plastic chair nearby, legs dangling, eyes red and swollen. No one offered him water. No one explained anything to him. Darius kept his gaze on his son. Eventually, Keller stepped away to make calls. That was when Claire Bennett's phone buzzed. She was sitting at her kitchen table, laptop open, half working on an unrelated piece. A message came through from a follower she recognized, someone who regularly sent tips from around the city. The video loaded. Claire watched Darius being handcuffed, watched Eli crying, watched the officer's body language, the crowd's reaction, the framing that turned a moment into an accusation. Her stomach dropped. "This is wrong," she whispered. She watched it again, slower this time. She noticed what wasn't there. No struggle, no aggression, no threat, just assumption. Claire didn't hesitate. She grabbed her jacket and keys, already pulling up the number for the Giant Eagle manager. She requested the security footage formally, citing journalistic review. The response came back quickly and politely. The footage was unavailable. Active investigation. Claire stared at the message, anger blooming cold and sharp. "They're writing the story already," she said aloud. Back at the station, Keller returned, his expression unchanged. "You're being held for questioning," he told Darius. Child Protective Services has been notified." Eli's face went pale. Darius swallowed. He had known this could happen someday. He had prepared for whispers, for stares. He hadn't prepared for the system to put its weight directly on his child. "Eli," he said gently, "listen to me. Whatever happens, remember what I taught you." Eli nodded shakily. "The truth doesn't need permission," he whispered. Darius smiled despite everything. "That's right." The doors closed behind them, sealing the moment. Outside, rain continued to fall. Somewhere between a grocery store and a police station, a story had already begun to spread. One that didn't care about facts, only about how things looked. And for the first time since Eli became a Carter, Darius felt the ground shift beneath them both. The holding room at the precinct was colder than the supermarket parking lot had been. The air smelled faintly of bleach and metal, and the walls were painted a tired beige that seemed designed to drain color from anything human. Eli sat on a hard plastic chair with his feet dangling above the floor, shoulders hunched, fingers locked together in his lap. Darius watched him from across the room, wrists cuffed in front of him now, close enough to speak but far enough to feel powerless. When the forensic medical examiner arrived, everything shifted. Dr. Leonard Shaw was a man in his early 50s, average height, thin to the point of sharpness, with wire-frame glasses perched low on his nose. His gray hair was neatly combed, his lab coat spotless. He carried himself with the detached efficiency of someone who had learned to separate bodies from stories. To him, details mattered more than context. "I need to examine the child," he said, voice flat. Eli's eyes widened. He looked instinctively toward Darius. "It's okay," Darius said softly. "I'm right here." The examination took place in a small, adjacent room. Darius could hear everything, the rustle of paper, the quiet instructions, the pause when the doctor inhaled sharply, then silence. Dr. Shaw emerged with a clipboard pressed against his chest. "There are multiple healed scars," he said, addressing the officers, not Darius. "Back, upper arms. Some linear, some irregular." Darius felt the words land like a physical blow. He knew those scars. He had seen them the first night at Mercy Hospital years ago, when he'd bathed Eli carefully, afraid to hurt him. The social worker back then had avoided details, only saying there were indications of prior abuse before abandonment. Darius had done everything right after that. Therapy sessions, pediatric checkups, photographic documentation, meticulous records. He had believed that doing things by the book would protect them both. Now the book was being used against him. "These injuries are not recent," Dr. Shaw continued, "but their presence raises serious concern." Concern, not proof, but concern was enough. Officer Keller's mouth tightened into something that almost looked like satisfaction. "Take him into custody," Keller said. Darius's knees nearly gave out. "No," he said louder than he intended. "Those scars were there before. I have records. Hospital records. Therapists. Everything." Keller didn't look at him. "You'll have a chance to explain." Darius was led away. Eli cried out once, sharp, panicked, but an officer gently, firmly guided him back to the chair. "It's okay," Eli whispered to himself, rocking slightly. "It's okay. It's okay." It wasn't. Within hours, the story had a shape. At the county prosecutor's office, Vincent Harrow leaned back in his chair and read the preliminary report with practiced calm. Harrow was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with salt-and-pepper hair and a confident, polished demeanor. He dressed impeccably, spoke smoothly, and believed deeply in narratives that won. To him, justice was less about nuance and more about clarity, especially the kind that played well in front of juries and cameras. He began outlining the case in 3 clean strokes. A black man adopting a white child, unusual, questionable. A child with scars, evidence of abuse. A frightened child in public, confirmation of coercion. Simple, efficient, convincing. Darius was transferred to county jail that night. The cell was narrow, concrete, and loud with the distant echoes of men shouting into the dark. He sat on the metal bunk, head in his hands, replaying every decision he'd ever made, every form he'd filled out, every appointment he'd attended. None of it seemed to matter now. The court-appointed attorney arrived the next morning. Thomas Green was young, barely 30, with a wrinkled suit and eyes that rarely met Darius's. He spoke quickly, as if time itself were an inconvenience. He skimmed through documents, nodded absently, and sighed more than once. "This is a tough case," Green said. "The optics aren't good." "I have proof," Darius said. "Medical records, therapists, teachers. My neighbor." Green raised a hand. "We'll see what's admissible." Darius stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means," Green said carefully, "that juries don't always respond well to complicated explanations." The first hearing moved fast. Too fast. Darius spoke when allowed, but his words were clipped short, redirected, reframed. When he tried to mention documentation, objections were raised. When he tried to explain Eli's history, the judge reminded him to answer the question. Eli was not present. Instead, a representative from Child Protective Services testified that the child had been placed in temporary care for his own safety. The phrase echoed in the room like a lie wearing a suit. The ruling came down swiftly. Darius was remanded into custody pending trial. Eli was transferred to a group children's home on the edge of the city. The separation broke something in both of them. The children's home was clean but impersonal. White walls, laminated floors, beds lined in rows. Eli was given a small locker and a number. The staff were not cruel, just distant, overwhelmed. At night, Eli lay awake, clutching the broken toy car he had kept since the church steps. He replayed the supermarket scene again and again, convinced that if he hadn't dropped the chocolates, none of this would have happened. "If I wasn't here," he thought, "Dad wouldn't be in jail." The trial date arrived sooner than anyone expected. Local media picked up the story. Headlines avoided names at first, then leaned into them. Phrases like alleged abuse and racially unusual adoption began circulating. The narrative hardened. The verdict, when it came, felt unreal. Guilty. Sentenced to death under a charge escalated by prosecutorial discretion and sensational framing. Aggravated child abuse resulting in life-threatening harm. Darius stood still as the sentence was read, the sound flattening into noise. He did not shout. He did not collapse. He simply felt the world close in heavy and absolute. In the children's home, Eli was told in fragments. He didn't understand the word execution, but he understood finality. He stopped speaking almost entirely after that. Claire Bennett couldn't sleep. She watched the coverage late into the night, anger rising in waves. She pulled out the folder she'd created months earlier, Eli Case, and spread the contents across her kitchen table. Notes, dates, names. One detail refused to sit quietly. Mercy Hospital. She went the next morning. The records department smelled of dust and paper. After multiple requests, Claire finally received copies of Eli's initial intake records from years ago. She scanned the dates twice, then a third time. The scars were documented before Darius Carter ever became Eli's father. Photographs, measurements, physician notes. The signing physician's name made her pause. Dr. Andrew Kellerman. A quick search revealed he had been quietly transferred after a records mishandling scandal that never quite reached the headlines. Claire exhaled slowly. This wasn't missed, she said to herself. It was ignored. She closed the folder carefully, as if it contained something fragile. For the first time since the supermarket, there was a crack in the story they'd built. And cracks, Claire knew, were where the truth liked to come through. The courthouse was already full before sunrise. News vans lined the street like a second wall of concrete. Satellite dishes pointed skyward, cables snaking across wet pavement. Inside, the air felt tight, recycled, humming with anticipation. This was the final sentencing hearing, broadcast live. One of those rare moments when the system invited the public to watch itself work. Judge Margaret Doyle presided from the bench, elevated and immovable. She was in her early 60s, tall with a rigid posture that suggested discipline honed over decades. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back severely, her robe immaculate. People often said she looked stern because she was stern. Others said it was because she had learned long ago that softness invited chaos. Whatever the reason, her gaze was sharp and unyielding, the kind that made defendants straighten even when there was nothing left to lose. Darius Carter stood at the defense table, wrists cuffed, shoulders squared. He had lost weight since the trial began. The jail food and sleepless nights had carved hollows beneath his cheekbones. Still, his eyes were steady. He scanned the gallery once, carefully, quietly. Eli was not there. The absence landed harder than any verdict. Darius felt it like a sudden drop, a hollowing out of the chest. He told himself Eli was safe. He told himself the adults had made a decision to keep him away from cameras and shouting voices. He told himself this was temporary. None of it eased the ache. At the back of the courtroom, Claire Bennett stood with a thick folder pressed against her ribs. She wore a dark blazer over a simple shirt, hair tied back, face pale from days without sleep. The folder was heavy with evidence, medical records, timestamps, names that didn't want to be found. She had tried to submit it earlier, but the clerk had barely looked up. "Not a party to the case?" he'd said. When the hearing opened, the prosecutor rose with confidence that bordered on ceremony. Vincent Harrow adjusted his cufflinks, cleared his throat, and began to summarize the case as if it were already settled history. He spoke of responsibility, of protecting children, of patterns that could not be ignored. He did not speak of doubt. He did not speak of records misplaced or ignored. He spoke cleanly, decisively, and cameras loved him for it. Darius's attorney sat stiffly, offering little more than procedural nods. When Darius leaned in and whispered about the hospital records again, the attorney's jaw tightened. "It's too late," he murmured. "The court's already ruled." Claire felt her hands shake. She raised them slightly as if the weight of the folder might make her visible. Judge Doyle's eyes flicked toward her. "You," the judge said sharply. "Sit down. You are not recognized." Claire lowered her hands, heart pounding. She had expected resistance. She had not expected the door to close this completely. The prosecutor concluded. The room exhaled. Judge Doyle adjusted her glasses and prepared to speak. That was when the doors opened. The sound cut through the room like a dropped plate. Heads turned. Cameras swung. A ripple of confusion spread from the back benches to the front. Eli ran in. He looked smaller than Darius remembered, thinner. His hair was uncombed, his cheeks hollowed by weeks of crying and poor sleep. He wore a borrowed jacket that hung off his shoulders and clutched the broken toy car in his hand like a talisman. His eyes were red and swollen, but they burned with determination. Gasps filled the courtroom. "Remove the child!" Judge Doyle snapped, rising halfway from her seat. The bailiff moved forward, hesitant. Eli didn't stop. He walked straight down the center aisle, steps uneven, breathing ragged. When he reached the open space between the tables, he turned toward the bench. His hands were shaking so badly the toy car rattled against his palm. "Please," he said. His voice cracked, but it carried. "Please listen." Judge Doyle froze. Darius's heart slammed against his ribs. "Eli," he whispered, barely audible. "It's okay." Eli looked at him then. Really looked. And something in his face steadied. He turned back to the judge, then to the gallery, Then to the cameras. "I know I'm not supposed to talk," Eli said, "but if I don't, my dad is going to die." A hush fell. Even the prosecutor stilled. Eli swallowed and began again, slower now. He did not speak like a witness. He spoke like a child who had been carrying a truth too heavy for too long. "He never hurt me," Eli said. "Not once. When I had nightmares, he held me until they stopped. When I was scared, he stayed. When I couldn't read, he read with me. He skipped meals so I could have books. He took me to doctors when they found the scars on my back because they were already there. He didn't pretend they weren't." A murmur moved through the room. "I got those scars before," Eli continued. "Before he was my dad. He didn't give them to me. He tried to help me forget them." Judge Doyle's face had gone still, her expression unreadable. "And when the police took him," Eli said, voice shaking again, "I cried because I thought it was my fault because I dropped the chocolates. Because I'm here." He paused, then lifted his chin. "But if he was bad," Eli said, "I wouldn't be alive." The sentence landed like a bell struck in a quiet hall. Darius closed his eyes. Tears burned, but he did not let them fall. The cameras caught everything. The tremor in Eli's hands, the wet shine in his eyes, the way the room leaned toward him without realizing it. Within seconds, clips were spreading. Commentators stopped mid-sentence. Social feeds lit up. Why wasn't this heard before? Who ignored the medical records? Why did a child have to save his father? Judge Doyle cleared her throat. For the first time that morning, her voice was not sharp. "Who brought this child here?" she asked. A woman from Child Protective Services stood slowly. She was short, with tired eyes and a practiced neutrality that faltered now. "I did not authorize. I asked who brought him," the judge repeated. Claire stepped forward before she could stop herself. "I did," she said, "and I have evidence." The prosecutor objected immediately. "Your Honor." Judge Doyle raised a hand. "Enough." She looked at Claire. "Approach." Claire's knees nearly buckled with relief as she walked forward and placed the folder on the clerk's desk. Her hands were steady now. She had crossed a line where fear mattered. "These are original intake records from Mercy Hospital," Claire said. "They document the scars before adoption, with dates, with photographs. They were excluded." The prosecutor leaned forward, color rising in his face. "This is highly irregular." "So was this trial," the judge said. The courtroom buzzed. Judge Doyle glanced again at Eli, who stood bravely, eyes flicking between the adults. "Young man," she said, her tone gentler than anyone expected, "you should sit down." Eli nodded and allowed the bailiff to guide him to a bench near the front. Darius watched every step, memorizing the way Eli's shoulders straightened when he sat, the way he held the toy car like proof he belonged somewhere. The judge turned back to the bench. "In light of new testimony and potential evidentiary omissions," she said, "this court will suspend immediate sentencing pending review." The words rippled outward. Gasps. Shouts quickly hushed. Cameras zoomed. Outside the courthouse, the story exploded. Live feeds replayed Eli's words again and again. Commentators argued. Experts weighed in. The public, finally invited, asked the questions the courtroom had not. Why now? Why not before? Inside, Claire exhaled for the first time in days. She met Darius's eyes across the room. He nodded once. Gratitude, trust, a promise. Eli watched them both, chest rising and falling fast. He had done the only thing left to him. He had told the truth, and the truth, broadcast live, could no longer be silenced. The pause, ordered by the court, did not slow the world outside it. It accelerated it. Within hours of Eli's words echoing across the broadcast, the story broke through its frame and spilled everywhere. Screens replayed the footage of the supermarket from 100 angles once the court compelled its release. In the grainy, wide shot, Eli was not shrinking away from Darius at all. He was flinching when a voice rose, when a hand grabbed too fast, when fear arrived wearing a badge. In a tighter angle, a moment froze people mid-sentence. Eli stepping in front of Darius, small shoulders squared, trying to shield him as the cuffs came out. It was not subtle. It was not ambiguous. It was unmistakable. At the same time, Mercy Hospital's records were unsealed. Dates lined up. Notes matched. Photographs corroborated what Darius had said from the beginning, that the scars predated the adoption and had been documented, treated, followed. Therapy reports were added to the record. Session after session where Darius had shown up early, asked questions, learned how to help a child carry pain without letting it become identity. An independent pediatric trauma specialist, Dr. Helena Morris, a compact woman in her 40s with steady eyes and a voice trained to calm chaos, testified that the allegation of abuse was a chain of inference built on bias, not evidence. The prosecution's case unraveled thread by thread. Vincent Harrow held a press conference he did not intend to hold. His suit was still sharp, but the confidence had dulled at the edges. He spoke about new information and the importance of review. He did not apologize. He did not need to. The record did that for him. Officer Brian Keller was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Body cam footage surfaced that contradicted his report. Procedures had been ignored. Language had been loaded. The department announced a review of stops involving guardianship disputes. It was bureaucratic phrasing for something simpler. Eyes were finally open. Inside the jail, Darius waited. The days between suspension and resolution felt longer than the months that came before. He rose at dawn, folded his blanket, and sat on the edge of the bunk listening to the building breathe. Other men asked questions in low voices, offered nods of solidarity that meant more than words. Darius wrote letters he never sent, sentences addressed to Eli that he carried in his head like prayers. Claire Bennett did not stop moving. She filed requests, cross-checked timelines, and published a long-form investigation that laid the case bare without spectacle. Her writing was precise and unadorned. She named failures without turning people into caricatures. The piece spread because it respected the reader enough to trust facts. Other journalists followed. Patterns emerged. This case was not alone. Judge Margaret Doyle reconvened the court in a room packed beyond capacity. She listened, asked pointed questions, and allowed testimony that had once been waved away. When the motion to vacate the conviction was presented, the silence that followed felt ceremonial. "Motion granted," she said. The words were formal. The effect was seismic. The charges were dismissed. The conviction was overturned. The warrant dissolved into nothing. Darius did not move at first. He had learned not to trust sudden shifts. Then the bailiff approached, keys chiming softly, and removed the cuffs with care. The metal fell away. Darius flexed his hands as if relearning their shape. Outside the gates, the afternoon light had softened. Spring had found the city in his absence. Trees wore new green. The air smelled like rain and possibility. Eli waited with Claire near the curb, bouncing on the balls of his feet, the broken toy car tucked into his jacket pocket out of habit. He had grown in the months apart. Not taller exactly, but steadier. He watched the doors the way children watch horizons. When Darius stepped out, Eli ran. The impact was small and enormous all at once, arms around a waist, a head pressed into a chest, breath shaking free. Darius knelt and held on as if the ground might disappear again. He did not speak. Neither did Eli. They didn't need to. The language of reunion did not require sentences. Claire turned away and wiped her eyes, annoyed at herself for the weakness, then lifted her camera to capture a single frame for the record. She knew when not to intrude. They went home together. The apartment felt different with the door closing behind them. Quieter, warmer. Darius made grilled cheese the way Eli liked it, cut into triangles. They ate at the small table without talking much, listening to the building settle. Later, Darius unpacked the box of things Claire had brought back from the children's home. Eli placed the toy car on the bedside table and turned the nightlight on just to see it glow. That night, Eli slept without nightmares. In the weeks that followed, the city adjusted its posture toward them. Some people apologized awkwardly. Others avoided eye contact. A few sent letters that said simply, "We were wrong." Darius accepted none of it and all of it. He understood that change rarely arrived as a clean confession. It arrived as pressure, as persistence, as the refusal to let lies rest. Sarah Donovan visited one afternoon, stepping into the apartment with the same careful presence she brought to hospital rooms. She looked at Eli, healthier now, brighter, and allowed herself a smile she did not often use. She hugged Darius, brief and firm. "I'm glad you came back," she said. "So am I," he replied. Darius returned to work with his camera, but his assignments shifted by choice. He photographed families the city overlooked, kin stitched together by choice rather than blood, parents and children who did not match the boxes on forms. He took pictures that asked nothing from the viewer except honesty. Claire's investigation prompted a formal review. Policies changed incrementally, then publicly. It was not a revolution. It was something rarer and harder. Accountability. On a quiet evening, months later, Darius and Eli sat on the front steps of St. Agnes Church. The stone was warmer now. Eli swung his legs and asked questions about lenses and light. Darius explained how truth hid in angles and patience. Eli listened, thoughtful. "Dad?" Eli said, testing the word again like he always did, careful and proud. "Do you think people can learn?" Darius looked at the street, at the ordinary lives passing by. "I think they can," he said, "if they're willing to listen." Eli nodded, satisfied. He stood, placed the toy car on the step for a moment, then picked it up again and tucked it away. Some things were reminders. Some were anchors. The city lights came on one by one. Somewhere a siren wailed and faded. Life continued, imperfect and alive, and in the end, the verdict that mattered most did not arrive with a gavel. It arrived with a child who stood up when it counted and said without fear or flourish what the truth had always been. "That's my father, and he saved me." In the end, there was no grand celebration and no eloquent speech recorded. Just a quiet evening in the city. The kind of quiet after a storm has passed. Darius walked home with Eli beside him, their shadows stretching across the pavement. People still watched them. Some curious, some embarrassed, some understanding, but few were afraid, not because the world had suddenly become fair, but because a story had forced it to stop. They realized that racism rarely manifests itself through hatred. Often it lurks in assumptions, in questions asked too quickly, in systems that decide who looks right and who looks wrong before the truth is heard. It is loud when challenged and invisible when ignored. Eli stopped on the steps of the church where their story began and looked up at Darius. "If they think you're a bad person," he whispered, "then they've never really seen you." Darius smiled, not bitterly, but with understanding. "That's why we stand where we can be seen." They walked together, hand in hand. Not as symbols, not as headlines, but as father and son. And between the streetlights and the silence, the world learned a simple but profound lesson. Justice doesn't always come from power or authority. Sometimes it comes from love that never fades. And a son brave enough to say, "This is my family."